So we'll talk about what they call practical antennas as opposed to isotropic radiators. So a little bit on phased arrays, ground effects, long wire antennas, folded dipoles, off-center fed dipoles, ZEPs, G5RVs, and rhombics. I guess these are all practical because people use them, but I've only seen most of them in books. Although I do have a G5RV, but I've yet to put it up.
Oh, yeah.
So if I have if I want to use a Yagi, I need a tower in order to mount them. But another way to get a directional antenna without having a tower is use phased vertical arrays. Of course, you could still have them on towers, but you could have quarter wave verticals ground mounted and use two or more of them to get a phased array and affect the pattern, make it directional. So depending on how you feed it, whether the spacing of them and whether you feed it in phase or out of phase determines what the pattern is going to be. This is just an example of like a typical, this is what they do for radar. Well, they have a big array of little dipoles and they could change the phasing going to them and actually sweep the pattern without mechanically moving anything. I saw a Russian radar that used that technique. It had 1,024 little dipoles in a big round thing.
That sounds like what's in the nose of B2. Well, the Navy ships will flex panels and it's all SDR.
It was called a flap lid.
Yeah. These SDR now too.
Okay, so if I have two quarter wave verticals and I put them a half wavelength apart and I feed them 180 degrees out of phase, I'm going to get a figure eight along the axis of the array. Whereas in a dipole, it's broadside. So this is along the array. If I put them a quarter wave apart and feed them 90 degrees out of phase, I get a cardioid. You know what a cardioid is? Looks like a heart, sort of. It has, the main thing is it has a very sharp null at single point. It's basically zero radiation at that point, and then more like omnidirectional around the other half. If I space it a quarter wave and feed them in phase, then I get a broadside, a figure eight broadside to the array like a dipole. Okay, so if I feed them in phase, half wave apart, then I get this along the array. If they're 90 degrees out of phase, are those wrong?
The phase.
When you feed it, you actually have,
I mean, in the chart there, is that the
well,
purple lines or whatever you call them?
I think that is, well, this one would be the beam width. That's about the 3 dB point where those cross. See, this -5. That'd be about 3 dB. I haven't a clue. Well, that's 3 dB again. So I guess that's the beam width in those. That's pretty wide for a the cardioid is
That's what the middle one is part of it.
That's a cardioid, yeah. Right. And then over here, again, that's 3 dB point. So we've got our figure 8. I guess the question is, what direction is the end? Where are the two antennas?
Yeah, I don't know how they're getting phased.
That's a good question. They don't tell me down here in the small print. They give you sideband gain and beam width and all this stuff. Okay. But the intent there was just show the different patterns. So if we go back, let's see. So if I'm half wavelength apart and out of phase, I should have a figure 8 along the axis. Which would be this. So maybe this green blue line is the axis.
But they're describing the one on the left, aren't they? The first one in that.
Well, this is zero. This is in phase. For in phase, I'm going to get broadside to the axis. So
Vertical is the axis.
I guess the vertical is the axis for all of them. It's confusing. I'll have to go add something else to that chart. And they're in the opposite order than we talked about. Yeah. We talked about this one on the right, and then the cardioid, and then this one. Or else the labels at the top are wrong. But I don't ever screw up. What type of radiation pattern is created by two quarter wavelength vertical antennas spaced half wavelength apart and fed 180 degrees out of phase? These are always hard for me to remember.
Either C or D, I mean.
C or D, huh? Okay. Delta along the axis. Okay, so if we're quarter wave apart and 90 degrees out of phase, that one's easy to remember because it's different. Spacing is closer, and it's the only one that's 90 degrees. So that's our cardioid. This is what you want for direction finding.
Yep.
You would think you'd want gain, you don't. You want just the opposite. You want a null.
Oh,
And most antennas have more than one null. Now we're quarter wavelength, or half wavelength apart and in phase. So it's going to be broadside or in fire. Which one?
So I did the axis.
Okay, so ground effects as in free space, you're going to have basically symmetrical lobes like on a dipole. As in the real world, where there's a ground effect, you only see those lobes like the upper half of them. And depending on the type of soil, it's going to affect the shape of those lobes. So here again, seawater is this nice green one on the outside, so you can see what a difference it makes if you're over seawater. Very low takeoff angle, much larger lobes. Whereas if you got poor, rocky soil, or dry sand. You're over here in the poor. What confused me on this chart is they're showing that moderate is actually worse than poor, which, but it's not my chart. And I would assume hamradio.me, whoever they are, got their data right. But the basic thing is saltwater versus rocky ground makes a big difference. How is the far field elevation pattern of the vertically polarized antenna affected by being mounted over seawater versus soil?
What's in the ground?
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely.
Well, if delta is true, alpha can't be true. And I didn't see any additional lobes.
You can see additional load, but it's a bigger load.
Right. So what are we going to go with?
Yeah.
Let's go with delta. Okay. A lot of stuff here. If we have a horizontally polarized antenna and we put it on the side of a hill where it's not flat ground, it's sloping, then that radiation pattern is going to follow the slope. So we'll have a lower rate takeoff angle on the downside of the hill than we do on the upside of the hill, because it kind of follows the ground. In the case of a beam antenna, if we change its height, its takeoff angle decreases as we go up. Okay. But like I said before, you start getting extra lobe. So it's one of those trade-offs. You want to maximize the takeoff angle, or you want to maximize the power in a lobe. And you can't have necessarily both. And for DX, you probably want the lowest takeoff angle, because that's going to give you the largest hop. How's the radiation pattern of a horizontal polarized antenna mounted above a long slope compare with the same antenna mounted above flat ground? Yeah, you have to read this one. So it's following the ground. Is it going to increase or decrease the angle compared to horizontal?
I think it's gonna be.
Very good. What's the radiation pattern of a horizontally polarized antenna, or how does it vary with increasing height? Remember, it's a trade-off. So why do you want to get your antenna higher? To go farther, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do you go farther?
You just said the lower the takeoff angle is better for DX,
Right,
so it goes further.
right. So how do you get a lower takeoff angle?
It's closer to the ground.
No, no.
Oh, you're talking about bouncing off the ground, so then you gotta raise it up to a point.
Well, as you go up, I mean, it keeps decreasing the takeoff angle, but then you get all these extra thingies.
The way I remember that is that as you get higher, you get closer to free space where you have a symmetrical vertical profile.
Right.
So it lowers it down from the ground. As you get closer to the ground, it squishes it up from the ground, from the lower portion of that lobe. It flattens it out to get closer to the ground.
What you're saying is, if you're in free space, you'd have symmetrical lobes. It'd be the toroid, essentially. As you get closer to the ground, then they get flattened and raised up a little bit. Okay, so wire antennas, you can have a long wire, you can have a folded dipole, off-center fed or end fed, which is what the ZEP is, or a G5RV, which is a little bit a variation of some of those. So in a long wire, it's just a long piece of wire. So it's a non-resonant antenna. So you definitely need a matching network or antenna tuner because of the SWR. And one of the things, the longer the wire, the more it aligns along the length of the wire. The more the lobes align along the length of the wire. So you get, for a infinitely long wire, you just have one skinny lobe that followed the wire. Like the pattern over here on the far right. And even your little extra side lobes are all pointed that same way. So what happens to the radiation pattern of an unterminated long wire antenna as the wire length is increased? Even though you got extra lobes, they're all basically aligned in the same direction. A folded dipole. Usually you build these out of twin lead, 300 ohm twin lead. Why do you do that? Because the impedance is 270 something ohms. Why is it that? If you got a dipole, it's 72 ohms, right? When we do some magic, like put another wire in parallel, tied together, it in effect is a transformer with 2-to-1 turns ratio. So what's the impedance ratio? 4-to-1. What's 4 times 72? Right.
Would you ever calculate?
Huh?
And he's using that, you ever calculate? You're going down and use it.
And there's a plot of a folded dipole, fairly sharp resonant point. And at this point down here, this is done with EasyNet. It measured 279 ohms on the model.
Can you back up the front?
Yeah.
All right. I've heard of them, I've never seen it, but you take the 300 ohm twin lead,
Mm-hmm.
and calculate somehow how long it has to be
half a wavelength,
from end to end or from the
in
feet?
end to end. Standard half wave dipole.
Okay. Oh. And then.
Tie the ends together. Yeah.
So you got one piece
Yeah.
that's,
Just to make it like a TV line.
Right.
and it's kind of like you got a reflector and then the driver of two element gang.
I don't understand the physics of it, but supposedly it acts, that wire close to it and connected together somehow, in effect, is an air core 2-to-1 turns ratio transformer.
It's the two,
What?
is the drawing on the right?
Well, the one on the left is making it with 300 ohm twin lead. So you got to, and you feed it with 300 ohm twin lead because it looks like approximately 300 ohms. You've got to do the match somewhere else to get it back to 50. The one over here on the right is made from kind of like ladder line, where you've separated the conductors as just single wires. You still tie them together. And then you've got a 4-to-1 balun. Which if you're 50 ohms, that's going to give you 200.
So
Not a perfect match, but
both of those are full of diamonds.
they're both folded dipoles. One is just doing it with twin lead, 300 twin lead, like we used to do back in the TV days when you used to get it, or FM stereo.
If sometimes see the cheap little full of dipole box.
Yeah.
I got one in my attic from decades ago.
And I did.
So what is a folded dipole antenna? Charles. What's the approximate feed point impedance at the center of a 2-wire half-wave folded dipole antenna? Wyndham antenna, which is another name for the off-center fed dipole. I guess there was some guy Wyndham. I don't know where it came from. In this case, you're feeding it approximately 1/3 of the way from one end. So you need a 4-to-1 balun because it's supposedly around 200 ohms for that previous chart. The one thing one advantage is it becomes multi-band. So you can get close to resonance on multiple bands with an SWR below 2-to-1 or 3-to-1.
Isn't that one of the? I see them at field day, they have the sort of long pole with a wire and then they feed it about 20 feet from one end. So that's,
Yeah.
I see them.
Yeah.
I've seen them. I've never tried them.
And depending on where you actually feed it will affect the sort of resonance points and what the impedance you see is. So and I think I might have a chart showing 2 different ones and how it affects it.
Parts of the air guy used to do. Yeah. Is there just a little like fishing pole about 40 feet long and.
No, that's in bed.
Yeah.
That's what we use. Not all centers.
Right. The classic coax fed Wyndham is I actually put the balun there at the feed point. Means you got that heavy weight of the transformer there. So, and it's just showing for different um, heights what the radiation pattern is. And this is for 80 meters. So if it's up at 80 meters, you get this nice figure eight. When you're down at 40, you get a clover leaf. At 20, you get a clover leaf with a couple more and more and more and more. Apparently, this doesn't make a very good invis antenna when it's close to the ground. Although I'm not sure exactly what it does when you're down at, a few meters. This is a plot of feeding it at 25% from the end and 33 and a third percent from the end. And you can see how the pattern changes. So we're down here at, let's see, there's a marker up here. That's 20 meters where at that point. So it's not very good at 20. You're getting, but if you're 33 and a third, you can get 20.
Is that SWR?
Yes. Yeah. And I drew the line at 3. So, you should be able to match any one of these, although they're not all within the amateur frequency bands. And depending on, where your match is determines which set you get. And of course, it's totally different at 50%. Then it's a half-wave dipole. So you're going to see harmonics. So what's the purpose of feeding an off-center fed dipole between the center and one end instead of at the midpoint? Sounds good too.
Did you say Trump?
I don't know.
No.
Let's see. A similar feed point impedance on multiple bands. Well, it did that, right? Did it resonate across a wider range of frequencies?
Well, that's what those little dips were in the SWR, didn't it?
Yeah. But I'm not sure it was actually resonant. Let's see what they say.
Oh, that can't be right.
Why can't it?
Similar
It says right up there, the answer is A. That's right out of the question pool. It must be right.
Well,
Let's see, what's yeah. But it never said resonant.
it have to be more resonant or it would be any good.
No. Random wire, long wire are not resonant.
And it's not that good.
Well, it depends on what you're trying to do. So you have to remember it's not the answer you thought. Okay, we have a ZEP. As I understand it, that was invented by the Germans with their Graf Zeppelins. And that's the kind of antenna that they use strung under the dirigible. So it's a half-wave dipole. Very high impedance at the feed point because you're feeding at the end. So it's the high voltage point. You have zero current at the end. So therefore you have a high resistance and a high voltage. Almost zero current. Apparently there's some effect where you get some leakage off of the radiation off of the end. So there is some tiny amount of current that flows at the very end of the wire. The basic difference between this and a standard end fed is they use quarter wave length of transmission line as a impedance transformer because they're only worried about a single frequency to get it closer to 50 ohms. There's an extended double ZEP, which is center fed, but it's 1.25 wavelength long. In other words, 2 5/8 elements. You see that a lot on verticals. Mobile verticals will be 5/8 instead of a quarter wave. And there's a picture showing they're feeding almost at the end. And they're using, in this case, it looks like window line or something like that. That's a quarter wavelength long. And they feed it and it's shorted on this end. So they're feeding it at a point along that line where it looks like 50 ohms. Because that quarter wave line shorted is going to act like a transformer. And the impedance is going to vary along the line. So you pick a point where it's 50 ohms to actually feed it. This is just showing a similar center fed feeding it the same way with the transmission line as a transformer. And we're going to see that as the G5RV, I think.
What's the number, for 0.64?
64? Yeah, 5/8
Oh, okay.
approximately. Yeah, this one says 450 ohm ladder line. And here's a plot of, and you can see up here the 3D or the 3 SWR. So it's got lots of points. And it gets down below 1.5, quite a few places, very narrow bands. This marker is at 7 megahertz and it's 40 ohms. So which of the following describes the ZEP antenna? It's just an end fed with a different way to match it using a quarter wave transformer, which we haven't talked about yet.
But the diagrams that you had before showed it off center fed.
They didn't show it exactly at the end, but it was pretty close.
So it would be considered, okay.
And that was the only drawing I found for one. Maybe they did feed it, not quite on the end, I don't know. But there was nothing indicating how far from the end it was. It definitely wasn't 25%. Which of the following describes an extended double ZEP antenna? And that was the other drawing on the right. The double set, where it's center fed and it's 5/8, but they still use the same kind of matching transformer. The G5 RV is another multi-band dipole. Fed very similar, where they use open wire transmission line. It's not quarter wavelength, it's a specific length. I'm not sure how they come up with it. And the dipole itself is not a half wavelength long. So it's like a half wave dipole, only it's not. I guess it was originally designed as a 20-meter antenna, but it says you can tune it, which means you can get within adjustable SWR on other frequencies. Like I said, I have one, but I've yet to put it up and see whether they really work. Cost me about $100. So, well, it was already made. That's true. Yeah. At Hamfest. Yeah. So you got, you got over 100 feet of wire. And it's heavy gauge. And then you got 34 feet of ladder line. And then in mine, I don't know if there's a balun or anything in there, but it terminates in an SO239 connector. So supposedly it's 50 ohms at that point. This is showing it fed with 75.
Yeah, to get to the coax, you need some kind of balance.
I don't know how it works. But you can get, depending again on the different frequency bands, this is the radiation patterns that you see. So down here at 80 meters, you very omnidirectional. 20 meters, you get this nice figure 8. And then as you go up, you start getting more and more lobes.
What's G5RV stand for?
Not a clue. I'll have to look that up and put it on the next set of slides that I do. So which of the following describes the G5RV? I think it was the guy's call sign. Yeah, it's definitely a British one. And only Brits would come up with something like that.
Well, currently, the call sign is held by a club,
Okay.
but I think you're right. I think it was the call sign of the guy that developed it in town.
Okay, it's Alpha.
You think it's Alpha? It's Alpha. Okay, rhombic. You got a rhombic in your backyard? Yeah, these are supposed to be practical, but not many people can do a rhombic. It takes a lot of wire. Yeah. And you can't move it. You got to pick your direction and you're stuck with it because it's over a wavelength long.
Can you move your black box and see the drawing?
Sure. I don't remember how to make that disappear. Maybe it's that one. Oh, there we go. Now I got to get rid of that one. Okay. So it's a rhombic shape and it's either open-ended or terminated on the opposite end from the feed. So depending, if you leave it open-ended, you get a bidirectional pattern. If you terminate it, you get a unidirectional pattern.
What is the pattern? What's it look like?
It looks like, glad you asked, that.
Which one? Oh.
Terminated, you get a big lobe along, and I think it's in the direction of the terminating resistor with these side lobes. If it's unterminated, you get a lobe each direction. So it's a directional antenna, but it's also basically a receiving only antenna because of the fact you got a terminating resistor. Unless you want to have a really expensive heat sink resistor out there. Yeah,
Remember in
that's in the next set.
in Ethiopia, they had a transmitter field and a receiver field. It's totally separate. And Ramek's out there for miles.
So what's the effect of adding a terminating resistor to a rhombic antenna? I suspect the length to width of it has some effect too, but I haven't seen anything that says how that affects the pattern. I would think if it was more like a diamond, okay, you'd get a totally different kind of pattern than you do as a squished one. Okay, so we talked about the phased arrays and how you get broadside, inline, and a cardioid. The cardioid is the only one I ever remember because it's different. How ground affects the takeoff angle and things like when you're over seawater or you're on a hill. Long wire antennas align along the axis of the antenna. Folded dipoles are 300 ohm impedance because of that 4-to-1 transformer effect. It doesn't really matter what you make it out of. It just was convenient to make it out of twin leads since it was 300 ohms. And it worked well for a stereo receiver because they usually had a couple screws on the back that you connected 300 ohm line directly to it. Off center fed, you get a similar impedance on multiple bands. That's the one where we disagreed about resonance. The ZEP is just an in-fed half-wave dipole fed with a quarter wave transformer, essentially. And the extended double ZEP is a center-fed 5/8 wave. Well, 5/8 element, 1 1/4 wave. The G5RV is center-fed, not a half-wave length, and through some, I don't know how they determined the 30-something feet or whatever it was of open wire to feed it with. I guess G5RV determined all that when he tried to optimize it for 20 meters. And the rhombic is an in-fed rhombic shape that can be bidirectional or unidirectional. Okay.